Commercial leases are long, complicated documents, and there are a lot of terms that you need to understand. Let's go through the top 10 most controversial lease terms that we see on a consistent basis in negotiating commercial leases. We're going to go over what each lease term is, what it means, and how landlords and tenants typically view the term. We won't waste time on rental rate or free rent. Everyone knows what those are. But there's a long list of other terms that create friction between landlords and tenants during negotiations. Let's start with tenant improvements, or TI for short. TI is the money the landlord pays for the build out of the space. There are two primary ways that TI is structured. The first is what's called a TI allowance. This is when the landlord provides a fixed allowance towards the build out. If the cost exceeds the allowance, the tenant is responsible for paying the difference. The second is called a turnkey TI allowance. This is where the landlord and tenant agree to a specific scope of work, and the landlord covers the full cost to deliver the build out according to the agreed upon scope of work. If costs exceed the original budget in a turnkey allowance, the landlord absorbs those costs. Landlords prefer TI allowances for obvious reasons, because the allowance caps their exposure to construction costs, and any cost overruns are the tenant's responsibility. Tenants prefer turnkey. Tenants hate putting money into a space in someone else's building that they don't own, and a turnkey allowance allows the tenant to know they're going to move in the space without any unexpected construction costs that they have to pay for. Next is the commencement date. The commencement date is the date the lease officially begins. There are two common ways to structure a commencement date. The first is a fixed commencement date. This is when the lease starts on a specified date regardless of the status of the build-out. So if a lease is signed on June 1st and the lease has a fixed commencement date of November 1st, the lease is starting on November 1st, even if the build-out isn't complete. The second common structure is what's called a commencement upon substantial completion. This is when the lease starts when the build-out is substantially complete. So if a lease is signed on June 1st and construction was supposed to be done by November 1st, but there were construction delays that prevented construction from being done on November 1st, the commencement date is pushed out until construction is actually complete. So on a commencement date upon substantial completion, the landlord is eating the cost for construction delays, not the tenant. The next controversial lease term is a right of first refusal, commonly called a ROFR. A ROFR gives the tenant the right to lease a space that is not the space they've leased. It's a different space, whether it's next to them or on another floor. But the tenant has a right to lease that space before the landlord can lease it to anybody else. So if the landlord receives an offer for a space a tenant has a ROFR on, the landlord has to notify the tenant, provide the terms that the landlord is willing to accept, and then the tenant has an opportunity to take that deal. Landlords hate ROFRs. They complicate leasing and require tracking and cause administrative headaches for landlords. Think about it. If you have 100 tenants across your portfolio and 30 of them have ROFRs, every time you're leasing a space, you've got to dig through all those other leases and make sure no tenants have a ROFR. Next controversial lease term we're going to talk about is renewal options. A renewal option gives the tenant a right to extend their lease term when the term expires. There are two common structures for renewal options. The first is a fixed rate renewal. It's very simple. The renewal rate is predetermined and specified in the lease. So if the lease says the renewal option is at $20 a foot and the tenant exercises the option, $20 is the rate. The next is a fair market value renewal option. This is when the renewal rate is at market value at the time of the renewal. Landlords hate renewal options because they provide absolutely no benefit to the landlord. They're downside only to the landlord, no upside. Think about it. If a tenant has a fixed rate renewal option and the market goes up, the tenant is going to renew at the below market rate, and there's nothing the landlord can do about it. If the tenant renews with a fair market value renewal option, the negotiation is really no different than if they didn't have a renewal option at all. Next, let's talk about expense pass-throughs. This one's very, very important. This is how operating expenses are handled and passed from landlord to tenant. The key issue here is which expenses can the landlord charge their tenants for. Property taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance are common operating expenses that are usually passed through in most leases. But what about capital expenditures like new roofs and HVAC systems? Can those be passed through? And if so, are they passed through all at once, or do those large capital expenditure pass-throughs have to be amortized over the useful life of the item that was replaced or upgraded? Landlords want as much flexibility as possible. They want to pass through everything to their tenants and cover nothing out of pocket, including their capital expenditures. Next, let's talk about expense caps. Expense caps limit how much expenses can increase each year, and they usually only apply to controllable expenses. Non-controllable expenses, which are usually considered property taxes, insurance, and utilities, usually are not capped. Landlords hate expense caps because they limit the costs that landlords can recover from tenants, and they could lead to losses if operating expenses increase significantly. Tenants are obviously going to push for caps to get as much predictability as possible. Caps protect their budget from big swings in operating expenses, especially on controllable items like janitorial, landscaping, and management fees. Next, let's talk about security deposits. The security deposits are a mechanism to protect the landlord if tenants default on their lease or damage their space. The amount of the security deposit depends on the tenant credit and how much the landlord spends on the build-out. Startups or tenants with weaker financials usually end up paying higher security deposits than stable tenants with strong financials. Landlords see security deposits as a critical tool to protect them, and tenants see security deposits as unnecessary tied-up capital, and they want them to be as low as possible. Next, let's talk about guarantees. And guarantees can come in the form of a personal guarantee or a corporate guarantee. And what a guarantee is it's essentially a person or corporation that is not the tenant that is guaranteeing the lease or taking responsibility for the lease. So if the tenant doesn't fulfill their obligations, doesn't pay their rent, then that guarantor is responsible for coming in and fulfilling the tenant's obligation to pay rent. Personal guarantees are commonly seen when a startup is signing a lease or if the entity is new or doesn't have a lot of credit history. Now, landlords are always going to push for guarantees when the tenant is high risk, and the more guarantees, the better from the landlord's perspective. Some landlords require personal guarantees for any small businesses that sign leases, and tenants obviously want to avoid guarantees if at all possible. Next, let's talk about termination options. This is a clause that allows the tenant to terminate the lease early, before the lease expires, usually by paying a penalty. Landlords never want termination options. It creates uncertainty for the landlord, and it often reduces the value of the building. If a lease is going to have a termination option, the landlord is going to want that penalty to be as high as possible to offset the risk and uncertainty and reduce the likelihood that the tenant actually exercises it. The last term we're going to hit on in this video is assignment and subleasing. These clauses govern whether a tenant can assign their lease to someone else or sublease their space to a third party. Landlords want control over who their tenants are. They don't want to get stuck with an unapproved subtenant or an assignment that changes the credit quality of the deal. Most leases have some sort of sublease or assignment rights for tenants, but landlords usually have some of these approval mechanisms that we've addressed. Now, there are plenty of other terms that get controversial in lease negotiations, but these are the 10 that we tend to see come up most commonly and consistently across different product types, different deal sizes, and different tenant profiles. Be sure to follow for more commercial real estate breakdowns in plain English.